In contrast to most other CAD applications, Blender has a very rich set of pivot point tools, which can be used for object manipulation, rotate and scale specifically, and move. And in addition, Blender also has something called the 3D cursor as a pivot point. And this is a little bit unusual to some other programs. Alias actually does exactly the same or in a similar way like Blender with the pivot points, but it also doesn't have the 3D cursor. So let's maybe start with the 3D cursor first, because this one actually functions in two ways. So the pivot point for an object is always where the object center is. And wherever, for example, the 3D cursor is, I can insert an object. So when I press Shift A, there is the cube. If I reset my 3D cursor, I can do this either via the main menu and, for example, enter a value or right mouse button click and then insert another cube. You will see that the objects are always inserted where that 3D cursor is. So that's just for inserting. So it specifies actually X, Y, and Z. So if I go to here, just a point in 3D space where an object will be inserted. The second function the 3D cursor has, and this actually will be now usable for the pivot point manipulation, is we can, for example, scale something to this 3D cursor, or we can rotate around the 3D cursor. So for example, right now everything is set to bounding box. So if I press R, you see I rotate around the bounding box. And if I select, for example, two objects, you see my 3D widget jumps to the center. So think about there, we draw a big bounding box around those two objects, and the geometrical center gets actually the 3D widget. So if I press R, you can also see where, for example, the rotation dashed line has the center close to where my mouse is now. If, for example, I select this one, then the center of rotation adjusts. So this is, for example, the bounding box. If I go to 3D cursor, you see the widget for translation right now moves to where the 3D cursor is. So this way I can, for example, always rotate objects around a position in space which I can quickly specify. I could also say, if I go to this object, click this point, Shift S, snap cursor to the selected, and then go back into object mode. Now I can rotate all objects around the 3D cursor, and because I place a 3D cursor at that vertical edge, it looks like everything rotates around that edge of my cube. So this is, for example, the quickest difference between bounding box and 3D cursor. This always draws a box around your selection and then rotates around that point. 3D cursor, we just specify a point or a center axis. And then we also have, for example, something like, let's say, active element. So active element is always the last object you click. And you see it always then rotates around the object center point of that last object. So this is actually quite useful. And individual origins, for example, will let you rotate all objects around their own individual pivot point or object center. And we can even do the same with scale. And when we go back to active element, you see everything scales now to the active element. So you see with S it works. And when we go to 3D cursor, we can also scale to it. One of the very interesting features actually of the 3D cursor is also to quickly do an, let's say, a line of multiple points. So let me quickly delete all these objects. Shift S, cursor to the center. Let's create a plane. Let's zoom in. Let's maybe change this line a little bit there. Okay, so let's say along this horizontal line I would like to line up all these other points. There are two ways now how I could do it. I could switch to vertex select, go to bounding box, and then move this one up, hold Control and snap. And then this way I can actually align these points. A second way, much quicker, would be I select one point, Shift S, cursor to select it, switch my pivot point to 3D cursor, then I can select all these points, and I specified basically an x-axis, and then if I scale along the y-axis, so S and Y, I can flatten it. If I press 0, then everything will be scaled along the y-axis till it hits this point, and it will all be aligned on X. And this is basically the functionality of the different pivot points and the 3D cursor in a nutshell.